Hi, in this video I'm going to show you how to make a magnetized Dorset button. So something that you can use either as a pin keep or a fridge magnet if you want, why not? So let's get started. So the first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need to choose the design of your Dorset button. I have a book coming out this weekend, Dorset Ring Buttons, and the book's got 76 different designs, so there'll be plenty to choose from. The book's not arrived yet as I'm filming this, but here is a front cover for you so you can see what it will look like. So I'm going to make a Yarrell button in this video. It's a traditional design, and there's actually two versions in the book. So I'm going to do the more common version. So you need to choose a ring that will fit your magnet, okay? Because you don't want your magnet to be too big. I would advise that you use the strong magnets that you can get for crafting. I've tried it with the sheet, the black sheet magnet, and you cut it out, but they're not as strong. So if you want it just for like a fridge magnet, that's fine. But if you want to be able to use it as a pin keep, then the black really doesn't work. Also, if you want it to be a pin keep that you use on an embroidery that's stretched out on a hoop, so you've got a needle, a magnet underneath the fabric as well, you'll obviously need a second magnet and a bit more fabric. So we've got some fabric to cover the magnet, and obviously we've got the threads to make the button. So the first thing to do is you may as well get the magnet covered, okay? This is really, we don't even have to worry about an exact science. All that we want to do is to get this magnet covered with fabric. And that's the difficult part. When it sticks to your scissors, it gets even harder later on. So I'm just doing a rough circle. The raw edges of this will be encased, so you're not going to see them. So yeah, that should be absolutely fine. I'm going to use some of the thread that I will be making the button from. You can obviously use a sewing thread for this next part if you wish, because again, this is all not going to be seen. So I'm just going to work a back stitch so that I can do a running stitch all of the way around. Now, of course, you can use any button. You don't have to use a Dorset button for this. But what I have found is that if you use a ring button and you put the magnet behind it, it's better for the needle keep, because obviously you've not got the only thing that's sort of suppressing the magnetism is thread. Whereas if you've got too thick a button, too many threads plus wood or whatever the button's made out of, it can be a little more difficult for the pins to stick. So just test first. But as I say, you can use, a death's head or any other wrapped button. It doesn't matter. I just like using the Dorset button for it. It also is a nice way to show off your Dorset buttons, especially when you're working them with a more intricate design. So I've made a little pouch, and I'm just going to pop the magnet inside of it, just as you would imagine. And then I'm just going to go around again to pull in and really flatten this out. Now, something to remember when you're actually making Dorset buttons is that many designs, not all, but many designs are quite free with the number of spokes that you can wrap them with. So you don't have to sort of be rigid with quite a lot of the designs. You know, like a cross wheel can have 6 or 8 or whatever, and that will change the look of the design, which is quite nice. Okay, so that's pretty tight, and it's pretty tight around the edges. I've got a bit of surplus there, but that's all right. And I'm just going to do a little bit, I'm just going to do a back stitch, literally, because, and this is where it's hard, your scissors want to stick to the magnet. It's really quite funny. And then that little bit, because I had a bit of a tuft there, I'm just going to, with difficulties, trim off that excess. Okay, just to take the bulk out a bit. You don't have to do that. So that's our magnet covered, okay? Next step is we're going to cover the button ring. Some people, years and years and years and years ago, when I first started teaching Dorset buttons, it occurred to me that people might find it easier to get started with covering the ring if they used a little bit of beeswax. Okay, so a little bit of beeswax just on the ring, just to get you started. What that does is that allows that thread to not slip so much, because you can press it into the beeswax, you see, and the beeswax is a little tacky, and it'll just hold it there and stop it from slipping. It's funny because when I first sort of published instructions to do that, way back when, I now see that lots of people use them in their instructions, and it's quite neat. I had never seen it written down before, but it's quite nice that it's helped that many people. So I'm doing a blanket stitch, and I've caught the end of the thread. So I'll just close up and get this in focus for you, just so you, well, try to. Shiny metal doesn't like focusing easily. So you go under the ring with the thread behind the needle and come up so that the ridge of the blanket stitch forms on the end of your ring. Now I'm just going to trim off this tail because I've covered it in enough stitches now to hold. So this covering of the ring is called casting. And basically you want to cover the ring up with the stitches and then push them together and put in a few more. Can never hurt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on doing this, so you don't have to watch the whole process. So, one covered ring. And we need to lock this thread now. So I'm going to lock it by, let's get this a little more close up for you, going under the ridge, the beginning of the, usually the second stitch round. You don't really want to go through the first stitch if you can help it. And then that will lock that stitch into place, okay? And then you can see that right now what has happened is I have a little length. Now I've done this on purpose so that I can show you as well how to join on threads. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a little knot and keep it on that ridge, and I want to make sure that that's nice and strong. I'm going to trim that tail so that there's a little bit of a tail still so that you can see it, okay? And now to add the next length on so that I can work the spokes. I am going to use the same color. As I said, I wanted to show you how you can add color at this point, well, a new threads, which means that you can add color if you want to. And it's a nice way to liven up some of the more traditional designs. So I've threaded my needle just as I would ordinarily, and I'm going to place a couple of knots at the end of the one length. And then usually I like to start pretty much where I've ended. I will thread under the ridge again. And so you think, oh no, that's so ugly. Those knots at the end, that's not pretty. Don't worry about it, because this is not what you see because of the next step. So as I said, we've cast the ring. So that's in traditional speak for button making. So the next thing that we need to do is slick the edge. So slicking is turning, let's get this back in focus, close up again. Slicking is turning this ridge to the back of the ring. So you can use your nail, or you can use a tool, a slicker tool, to just turn that round. This slicker tool is in a new little tool set that we have, which also has a buttonhole gauge in it. Now that process has taken the ridge to the back, and it's also taken those knots to the back. So that's why this is an easy way to add on more thread. So if you're working on something and you want to change the color of your spoke threads, that's the way to do it. Or if you just misjudged, okay? So now what we need to do is we need to lay our spokes. So I am going to lay 6 wraps for 12 spokes, okay? The thread is at the back of the ring and at the top, and I'm going to come down right in the middle of the button mold and then go back up. So that's 1 wrap. I'm going to rotate slightly. Now I rotate anti-clockwise because I'm right-handed. If you're holding this in your right hand and working with your left hand, you will probably find it easier to rotate the whole thing clockwise instead of anti-clockwise, the way that I do it, which I think I might have just said that wrong. Anyways, anti-clockwise, if you're right-handed, tends to be easiest, okay? So I'm just going to rotate a little bit, and then again, straight up the middle. Okay, so that's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 5 went off a little off center. I can see that it did. So we'll just rewrap that. Now a couple of them are a little bit close, a little bit closer than the others, but I'm not going to worry about that at this stage. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to center it up. So I'm bringing the thread up and coming back down in a gap so that I can pull the threads at the back and the threads at the front together. Okay, so let's just bring this in sharp for you. And I'm going to carry on doing this until I feel that it's secured. You can put a whole load here if you want to and make a feature out of it as well. So I think that that's pretty much holding that. But as I said, you can see that some of these are a little bit crooked in that I'm not quite center, so I can push my needle to make that more central. And then I want to sort out the gaps. So take your needle, if you have a gap that's wrong, you take your needle underneath and move it over a little bit. Okay, you can just adjust your gaps that way. In fact, to make it even easier, I'm just going to secure by working a small stitch underneath. And now that centering isn't going to move on me while I fiddle about with getting these as even as I'm happy with. Okay. Now you can measure out and everything else. I don't mark Dorset buttons. Sometimes I will use a gauge to mark out divisions on swan knot buttons, but I don't tend to with Dorsets, only because that would mean marking on top of the thread that's covering the ring. So it doesn't feel right to me to do that. So there's a bit of fiddling. That's looking not bad at all. Okay, so come back into basic focus. Now we're going to work the design. So the first part of the design is to work rounding back stitches, which is the standard covering stitch for a Dorset cross wheel. Okay, now what this is we come up through a gap and then we come back around the one spoke. So then down, whoops, through the gap. Now that didn't help you at all because I wasn't holding on properly. So let's do it again. Back in focus. Let's do it again properly. Okay, so up and then back and down. So that is a back stitch. Okay, so the thread is going around the spoke. So nice and close up for you. Okay. And we carry on doing this around the spokes, around and around and around in a spiral. And I'm going to do this about halfway on this particular button. Okay, so I'll do a few stitches and then I will go ahead and pause this so that I can do it more quickly. And you don't have to get bored watching me do a bunch of rounding back stitches. So here we are, a load of rounding back stitches done. I'll zoom in for you. And you can see that that forms the ridges. So basically up till now, what we're working on is a Dorset cross wheel or cartwheel, depending on what terminology that you've learned. Now we're going to change it round to do the Yarrell. And I'm also going to change color here. So what I'm going to do is show you how one of the ways you can change color. The easiest is to simply bring your thread to those center stitches that you worked earlier. Take your needle under and then fasten it with a little knot. Just make sure it's nice and secure, and then you can trim that off. Now, a more complex way is to add the new color and weave it underneath as you're working, which obviously is great, especially when you're working on larger buttons, because you can manipulate that weaving a little bit better. But I'm just going to stick with knotting for the next stage as well, because this isn't going to be, well, number one, I'm quite happy with the way that I tie knots, and haven't had any real problems thus far. But also, this is a magnet, so it's not like I'm putting this through the washing machine or anything like that. So I've threaded up my new color and literally have fastened it with a knot at the center of the button. Another thing that you can do is split that thread, depending on what your thread is, just at the point of the knot. Again, I'll get this in focus so that you can see. And that will just also help if you bring that thread all of the way through, and it sort of creates another lock. So now what we need to do is the reverse back stitch, which now you've got, traditionally the reverse back stitch is what you are using for this, but you can work like a rounding back stitch over 2 spokes, but I won't complicate the issue here. We'll use the traditional. And that's where we come up in a gap. Again, I will zoom in here. So we come up on a gap, go over 2 spokes to go down, and then come up at 1. And this basically gives us a flat surface at the top. So if you watched my recent Yorkshire button video, Yorkshire button bookmark video, I also discussed these 2 stitches. Now, the reverse back stitch is literally that, in the sense that on the back you have the ribs. So that's why it's a reverse. It is a reverse of the stitch you've already done. And I'm going to carry on doing this as close up to the ring as I can. Now this particular design, I call this version of it, these days I call it a modern traditional Yarrell, because it is slightly different than the Yarrell buttons that were being produced in the early 1900s, when Lady Lees tried to get the industry, the cottage industry revival going. I've got one which I will show you a little bit further along in the video, and that is made in a different way, completely different way, although still over a ring. So the instructions for that one will be in the new book. Okay, so I'm going to carry on doing this, but you can see that what's happening is we're getting a nice flat face, and that's why this one lends itself so well to 2 colors. So I'll carry on and then come back to you when I've filled for the next step. As you can see, I'm working and I'm getting really quite close to the edge. Now, in my previous instructions, so in my DVD that was, let's see, well, a long time ago, over 10 years ago, I will have said to have go to the edge. But having since seen the revival Yarrells, I now work it with a little bit of a trick. You are quite the sort of modern traditional Yarrells just work to the edge. Okay, so you're absolutely fine if you want to stop there. And with some, if you're using a fat ring, sometimes that can be all that you need anyways, because the ring sort of takes up the border. But I'm going to show you how to close up those gaps entirely with this button. So I'm going to zoom in again so that you can see this a little bit better. And then what I'm going to do is I'm still working the reverse back stitch, but instead of going all the way through to the back, I'm just going to take the needle under the top spoke for the last, help if I could hold on to it, for the last few stitches. So obviously that's going to be tight because you will have put your spokes on nice and tight. I'm trying not to hold on too tight today because it's really hot and I don't want this to get all sort of sweaty. But I think I'm going to have to just live with it because I keep letting go. But it feels like, yeah, I've got a little bit of a knot at the end of that thread. So I'm just going to take that out. I've got a little knot caught in there. And that's what's pulling when I'm going underneath. Okay, so back to what I was showing you. So by doing this, we're pretty much completely covering up that gap between the filling and the ring. So it's quite an interesting way to work. And really any of the stitches, virtually any button, you could do this with, to go right up and over the edge. Okay, my needle has come unthreaded. So a good day all round. The biggest thing with this method is to try to make sure that you're not actually splitting the thread, because if you split the thread, you're not going to be able to get it pushed into position. And you'll end up with gaps elsewhere, which you don't really want. So right the way around. I think that's pretty well there. I'm just going to take the thread down to the back and again to the center. Now I'm knotting it there, but I wanted to show you another variation that you could do if you wanted to. And that is, you can come up and you could stitch through, which people don't think about this very often, and add extra detail in between these spokes. And it's a great way of adding a little bit of extra color to a ring button, because of course you can stitch through it. Okay, but for this one, I'm going to take those out, which is why I already knotted it. So I'm just going to take that back out. So I want to keep this plain. Now, as I said, the variation Yarrell buttons, I tend to refer to it in my head as a 1900s Yarrell button. This is it's one of the very few buttons that was made in silk. And as you can see, different number of spokes, but they've taken the reverse right the way round. I know it's hard to see because this is a deep purple, but there you go. So that variation, as I say, is in the new book. Okay, so we have our button. Get that back in focus. We have our button. We have our magnet. Now we have to join the two. So we're going to go back to the thread that matches the rim, okay? And I'm going to be using a crewel needle because it has a sharp point. Now, because I have a, I'm using a number 12 perlé cotton for this button, so it's not too difficult to thread it onto a finer needle. I'm going to knot the end, and it's the color that I'm using obviously is the color that matches the ring. So I'm just going to attach that to the ring. And this is probably going to be the most difficult part of the whole exercise, because what you want to do, I'm going to put the gathered part face down at the back of the button. Okay, so that looks nice and neat and tidy on the back then. And then we need to stitch through the fabric. Let's bring this up and zoom it in. I think some people call this a ladder stitch, but it's just a stitch. It's a connecting stitch. And then we're going to come underneath some of those covering threads on the button. And then go back. Try to keep your stitches fairly small, primarily because that will help to hold that magnet in place. Is you got to remember you're using a strong magnet, and obviously it's going to attach to something. So when you take it off of that something, you still want to be able to take it off without leaving the magnet behind. You don't want to just grab the button off of it. So there we go. So working it through. So if you're using a different type of thread button, for instance a death's head or something like that, or even a cloth covered button, the same process would apply. You can do these little stitches at the back. Now, of course, this is the same thing that if you wanted to cover the back of this button without a magnet, you'd basically do the same stitch. If you wanted to put a bit of felt or another little cloth covered disc to make a really finished button or even a brooch. So it's the same sort of principle all the way through. Nearly there. The other thing about smaller stitches is that if any of them give, being closer together, they're less likely to. I just stabbed myself, so let me just sort that out. Slippery needles and hot days are not nice. And nearly there. And then I'm just going to work a little knot. And then I'm just going to thread that under some of these. And pull through. Now here again is the hard part, because I'm going to cut that thin and look what happens. Cut that really close. So that's the most difficult part of the evening. And there we have it. One pin keep, or in this case, it's a nice strong magnet. It's a scissor keep. And that can go on your tool tin, or you can use it as a fridge magnet, because obviously it's terrific as a fridge magnet. Go ahead and pop anything you want and hold that in nice. So thanks very much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I will include a link to the new book, which you can't see there because of the light, and this is a nice, there we go. So I will include a link to the new book so you can have a look through. It's out this weekend, and 76 button designs, all step-by-step photos. So a quick flash of an example of what you'll get is all step-by-step photos. So thank you very much for watching. Do please hit subscribe, click like, and it'd be great if you hit subscribe with the bell icon to be notified when I upload the next video. And I will see you again. Take care, stay safe everyone. Bye-bye.